we'll start our program. I'm delighted to be here to introduce this conversation with the writer Dina Nayeri in our State of Democracy lecture series. And on behalf of the university, I want to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands we now sit. My name is Grant Reher. I'm the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University, and it organizes the State of the Democracy lecture series. And I have a lot of thanks to give. I'll try to be brief, but first of all, I want to thank those of you who are here in person. I also want to acknowledge our alumni and our friends and others who are watching on the live stream. I want to thank the Dean's office and our Dean, David Van Slyke, who unfortunately could not be here this evening, for supporting the lecture series. I want to give my thanks as well to Kelly Coleman and Jackie Nachevsky, who work in the Campbell Institute and help put together these events. And for this event, especially Jackie Nachevsky. And perhaps most of all, I want to thank the Berkmans, Norman and Marcia Lee, for their generous support of the series and of this event in particular. And Norman often comes to these lectures. He tries to come to as many as he can, but he couldn't make this one. And what I'd like to do is, for those of us who are here in person, is to thank him through the virtual channel with a round of applause. So thank you to the Berkmans. And I also want to be mindful of the fact that tomorrow is Veterans Day, so I want to thank any veterans who are in the audience or who are listening to the live stream for their service and for taking some of their time today to be here with us. Regarding our format, I'll make a brief introduction to Dina Nayeri, and then my colleague and Dina will engage in a conversation. This will be a conversation with my colleague and friend, Christy Anderson. And then that will be followed by a broader conversation with those of us who are gathered here. And when we get to that portion of the event, we'll have just one microphone, I think, tonight will serve us. And so I'll designate someone, call on someone, and once you've been recognized by me after you've raised your hand, when you get the microphone, I'm going to ask the usual three things I ask of everybody in this room when we have these. And that is, first of all, speak into the microphone so that you are part of the recorded archive of this series, and so that people here can hear you better, but also so that the people watching the live stream can hear your question or your comment. Be brief if you can, and then once you've asked that question or made that comment, please hand the microphone back to Jackie Nachevsky. At the conclusion of the program, we're going to have a reception outside. We will have food and drink. Dina will be available to sign both of her recent books, which we will have available for purchase for you. So before I introduce Dina, I do want to say a few words about her conversation partner, Christy Anderson. Christy is not just a colleague and a friend of mine. She's also been a great mentor to me and a role model over the years. She's an emeritus professor of political science here at Maxwell. And during her time on the faculty, she was a very popular teacher, especially among our graduate students, many of whom she shepherded through the program to successful completions of the PhD and great jobs around the country. And many of you probably will also know her through her role as one of the original and longest serving members of the panel making up the Ivory Tower on WBEZ. Yeah, you got some applause for that. So. Her academic work has been wide-ranging, but one of the topics that she's worked on is immigrant incorporation and civic engagement. So I'm delighted on many fronts that she was available to serve as Dina's interlocutor. But now for the topic and the speaker at hand. It seems like we have more than enough hot and divisive topics in our political and cultural systems these days, but perhaps none are thornier than the issue of immigration. And within that, how we should define and treat immigrants who are escaping something harmful and systematic in their home countries. And Dina Nayeri has stepped bravely and boldly into this space. As a refugee from Iran who arrived here in this country at the tender age of 10, and through hard work and talent, earned for herself a stellar education and created a powerful voice as a writer on these issues. Her writing is particularly effective as it blends keen observation, insightful analysis, and memoir in order to raise awareness and challenge assumptions and inform our thinking. The Ungrateful Refugee, with its deliberately provocative title, is, according to one reviewer, never sentimental, and her accounts of refugee lives, including her own, are unflinching, complex, provocative, and important. With her more recent book, Who Gets Believed, she's expanded that inquiry to broader questions about truth-telling and belief, to produce, according to another reviewer, a profound, gorgeous, devastating book, that rarest of creations, an original work about a condition in which we are all implicated. In addition to her writing, Dina is now on the faculty of St. Andrews University in Scotland. So we're very grateful that she is here visiting with us, and that in order to do that, she was willing to make the long journey that always exhausts me when I go from Britain back here to the United States, but she was willing to do it. So Dina, welcome to Maxwell School, and I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Christy Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's been a really, no, I didn't.
Got to switch on.
It's been a kind of immersive experience to read these two books of Dina's in quick succession during the last week. One of them is autobiographical, the Ungrateful Refugee. I'm interested in that title. I think that's really wonderful. The other one is also autobiographical, but it draws on interviews with and knowledge about not only the refugee bureaucracies in Britain, United States, and other places, but also talking to many other people who have things to say about who is believed and who is not believed, particularly people in medical professions, but more broadly than that. And I would urge everybody to buy these books. They're wonderful. If you can't afford the books, or you want a shorter version of some of the things that Dina is talking about, there's a wonderful article about her in The Guardian. This was in 2017, I think. 2017.
You mean an essay that I wrote, or a review?
No. About the article about you. And I found that to be...
there's been a lot of reviews there.
Well, okay, this one I really liked.
Yes.
It's more than a review. It really is. Talks about both of these books and their strengths, and it gives a good sense of what your arguments are, I think. So The Ungrateful Refugee is in large part autobiographical. Mm-hmm. How did you come up? I'm interested in the title. I love the title.
Thanks.
And how did you come up with that title? How did you expect people to react?
Yeah. Well, The Ungrateful Refugee started actually first with an essay. I wrote an essay in 2017 called The Ungrateful Refugee, and it was the first time I had stepped outside of fiction into my own real experience, and said, because, for me, I became a writer not to speak about anything, but because that was the right vocation for me. Mm-hmm. I loved to be creative. I adored sentences. I liked storytelling. I came from a culture of storytelling. Right. And I had lived this kind of astonishing life. And so I was comfortable using it in my fiction while hiding behind the fiction. And then in 2015 and 16, just so much happened in the world, and so much happened in my life to make me want to step out from behind that veil. We had here the Trump election in the UK where I lived. We had the Brexit vote. And then I became a mother all at once. And I had this, darling little girl who was also, suddenly I realized, oh my gosh, she has this heritage of, she's Jewish and she's Iranian and she's so many things that are, difficult in this world. And I don't want her to be spit out the way I have felt at times. And so I wanted to say something about everything that was happening. I wrote this essay called The Ungrateful Refugee, and out of that came the book. And the reason I titled it that in the first place was because I wanted to kind of push back on the idea that refugees should not only be grateful, but should express their gratitude, should display their gratitude and make a theater out of it for the benefit of the native born who are simply less than them. And so I thought, well, and gratitude is such a private emotion. It's a sentiment that we hold privately between ourselves and our communities and our family, loved ones, maybe our country, maybe our God. But it can't be redirected and it can't be compelled. And that's when it becomes ugly. And I think that many refugees feel that they do have to perform it.
Yeah. Yep. I think this is a quote from you, although I didn't put quotes around it, but immigrants and asylum seekers need to keep telling their story again and again. This is a quote, to earn our place to calm, casual skeptics. Every day of her new life, the refugee is asked to differentiate herself from the opportunist, the economic migrant. And I want to talk about that a little bit because, I don't think, at least in this country at this point, that economic migrants have it easy. But I agree with you. I think that they don't have to constantly say, we're so great. I am so grateful. And you do a good job of that. Even as a child, you realized you had to be grateful all the time.
So, no, I'm not saying in that way that the economic migrants and refugees are different. What I'm saying is that, in fact, the economic migrants are so much more reviled by people, that in fact, they cast all of the suspicion on refugees as well because they want to reject economic migrants. The argument I'm actually making is that this distinction is absurd. If people have to escape, if people leave their home, leave their families, leave everything that they've loved because they're in immediate physical danger, yes, that's more immediate, but is it at the end of the day that much more, I guess, harm to their well-being than not being able to eat, or survive or make money? And so we make this arbitrary distinction based on kind of just legal particularities that come from the Refugee Convention. I can talk about that if you like, but I find it arbitrary and unnecessary and undignified, terribly undignified, that we force people to prove that they were in a particular kind of danger before we'll give them asylum, help, hospitality, basic human, dignity of offering them life and happiness.
Yeah. No, I do want to come back perhaps to the distinction between these two kinds of refugees. And I agree with you that there's a lot of similarities. There are a lot of the same kinds of things they had to endure. And
so, we should define it. So basically, after the Second World War, kind of European countries got together and wrote the Refugee Convention. I believe 1946. Oh, no, 1951. And then the U.S. joined in 1967. Yes. So basically, the idea was that no country in this agreement would turn away people whose lives are in danger. They would live by this principle called non-refoulement, which means they won't send you back to a place where you could be killed. But they did make kind of a distinction about what kind of danger you had to be in order to qualify as a refugee. You had to have a credible fear of persecution for your life based on 5 categories. So it could be either based on your race, religion, national identity, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Right?
And later, gender was added to that, right?
Has it been? No.
Is that not true?
So in fact, it's such a massive argument there about whether or not gender counts as a social group. And I think it's one of the ways that people try to avoid the spirit of the Refugee Convention, because, did you notice that last category is so vague, right? Membership in a social group. And I believe, and many people believe, that the reason it's vague is because the framers of that convention were not... They knew in all humility that they couldn't predict what would happen next. Who would be the next group persecuted? Who would be the next, kind of category of people who would find themselves in danger? We'd just seen everything that happened with the Holocaust, right? So would that happen now to some other unpredictable group? they wanted to create a catch-all category, like etc. If you're in danger for these reasons or whatever else we can't predict. But now, you have people trying to interpret that last category into as narrow a way as possible. Women are not a social group. Battered women are not a social group. If you are recruited by a gang, not a social group. So it's kind of sad to see that happening, just legalese and.
Right. There's something in the book I think about is a family, a social group.
Yeah, exactly.
If your family is being targeted, are you then part of that automatically?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's difficult.
You think they can hear me if I
guess one question I have in terms of the refugees and their being compelled, in a sense, socially compelled to constantly thank people and feel grateful. Is this a particularly American situation, or is this happening elsewhere too, do you think?
That's a great question. I think it's human nature. I think what it is...
We let you in, you must be grateful,
yes.
or you'll be really angry.
And it's not just the letting in a refugee context. I think that it's about... we are born with certain things. We have certain kinds of luck. We have certain, advantages and disadvantages in life. But somehow we all grow up thinking we deserve every one of those. Our family earned this particular estate. Our people founded this particular country. We deserve this. These are our baselines, and we need to protect them. The desperation to protect that creates all kinds of, fears and biases, but it also creates the need to just, if you allow someone into your in-group, you need to be thanked. They need to acknowledge it. I kind of feel like it's an instinct close to the instinct that led to hazing. I feel like it's something kind of much more. What is it? Much more basic, I guess, in terms of human nature than.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. But it just seems like it's so ridiculous in a way that we make people prostrate themselves and just say this over and over again, or keep demonstrating their.
Well, I feel like most people that I have encountered, most of the native born, actually don't know that they're doing it, and they're not. There's no bad intention behind it. Really, it's just kind of an instinct, or it's just a lack of awareness about what is happening between them. Another thing is when we give. Sometimes it's hard for us to give psychologically and also even financially. And what we want is for it to be acknowledged. And we also want to sit on the perch of the giver. We give charity. We want it to be known. We want it to be we want it to be known by that person. And that creates this kind of dynamic that is pride and shame. We don't see the other side of it. But on the other side, in the situation of refugees, often people who have already been brought down so far by life, back in their own homes, they were all kinds of people, professionals, doctors, lawyers, carpenters, craftsmen, all kinds of things. And they had a full life. And here they are without any of those roots, any of that life, forced to accept charity. So the more visible that is, I think the more we're kind of creating a shameful kind of relationship, and a relationship that's not entirely based on honesty or curiosity or human connection.
And how would you describe the relationship between Americans or the people in whatever country and the economic refugees? It's different, right?
Yeah. Well, I feel like it's all very similar in the sense that we see it as an us and them kind of dynamic. Here are people from outside who come in for whatever reason. In the places I've lived recently, the dynamic between people in those two groups is that they feel that economic migrants are taking from them. Something from them. And so there's kind of more of a hostility there. And then with refugees, people kind of search around for their story and try to figure out whether they were lying and do actually fall into the category of refugee, or whether they're economic migrants in disguise. I think there's just a distrust there that kind of spans both categories. And of course, people don't go around with their papers pinned to their lapel. So you don't know what kind of a migrant that is. All you know is here is someone from, from Syria or from Mexico or from wherever. And, they're in your country. You assume they're taking something.
Right. And you assume they're taking your jobs, which is obviously not necessarily correct. And we need those those immigrants and so forth. But I think that you do in the Ungrateful Refugee and in the other book a really good job of describing that feeling that you felt as a child, even to the refugee. Is a quote, I think, from you. The refugee has to be less capable than the native. He must stay in his place. That's the only way gratitude will be accepted. Once he escapes control, he confirms his identity as the devil. You're not enough until you're too much. You're lazy until you're a greedy interloper.
Yeah. So I think what I was trying to describe there is this idea that, when you first arrive, or in those early years, according to, I guess, my experience and my research of other refugees, there's this idea that, you've arrived somewhere better. People will civilize you. The people there will help you and teach you, and you will be grateful to them, and that will be the relationship. And then eventually you will kind of disappear into society and be useful. But the idea that you'll be someone extraordinary, someone who will take on leadership positions, someone who will perhaps hire some of you, or, that is also very uncomfortable, I think, because the idea isn't for people to come and suddenly shine in this country, right? The kind of final goal has to be blending in, assimilation, right? And I think that right there, we all know assimilation also has a problematic kind of, meaning and all of that. But that's what people want instinctively.
Yes, although we have a tradition, I would say, in the United States of lionizing, in a sense, immigrants. I mean, immigrants who have made it big.
Yes.
And, people who invented the atomic bomb and people this and that. And so,
historic immigrants aren't really any threat, are they? So I think it's kind of a, yes, we like to take exceptional people and say, hey, look, we take credit for them. This is an American or, German or British or whatever, one of us, right? But look at the way, for example, people treat someone like Ilhan Omar. Look at the way people treat those who kind of dare to step out of their place now. They're the ones that I suppose are more of a threat or stepping out of line. Of course, none of this, you can't really be black and white about what the people think in a whole country like this. But it's just, I guess a lot of my work and a lot of what I write about is about like these recurring dynamics between the native-born and immigrants, and what it is that people sense from each other, much more often than you would think. So again, not trying to make a blanket statement about how everyone is, but I do think we are much, much more comfortable with, I guess, people who are compliant and thankful and useful and ordinary, and I think that's where the phrase ungrateful refugee comes from. I mean, the reason you hear that so much, funny enough, you Google that term, you're not going to get just my book. You're going to get a lot of references to that ungrateful refugee over there or whatever, Why should those two words be put together? Because they think that the baseline is gratitude for refugees, So otherwise it wouldn't be such a popular phrase.
Yeah. This is a question, I don't know quite how to put it, but assuming that you and I, at least, would like to have refugees not be so uncomfortable, not be so forced to be grateful all the time, what do you think that communities or subcultures or categories of people, I mean, I guess maybe phrase that as a question. Are there communities, subcategories of people, subcultures who do not who make refugees feel comfortable early on, who are not so demanding of them?
So,
I ask this because I've been involved in some refugee resettlement stuff, and certainly have talked to people about that. In my little town, we have now 2 or 3 refugee families that we've kind of welcomed, I think, in the past years. And if we do, as a community, want to not be pushing these people to feel ungrateful or
they don't feel ungrateful.
No, they are ungrateful. They should be ungrateful. I mean,
No, that's not what I'm saying at all.
No, I know it's not what you're saying. But what can we do to facilitate that? What can we do to build communities which are more welcoming?
I can answer that
sense.
certainly, but I should just clarify 2 things. The first one is that one of the things that I say is that refugees are, as far as I've seen, every refugee I've met is so tremendously grateful. And in fact, not just to God in the country, but to people around them. But I think we just need to allow people to process that incredible change and tragedy of losing their entire life and coming to a new place. Just let them process it in their own way and direct their emotions in the way that they need to direct it. So, the title of the book really is very much just, I guess, representative of something that I want to undo in the world. However, it's not also, this is my second point, I think not even that significant part of the book. So the book, The Ungrateful Refugee, though it was named that, it really kind of goes through the 5 stages of the refugee experience, starting from escape and then waiting and then, refugee storytelling and being believed, and then assimilation and integration, and then cultural repatriation. And in each of these, there are things that I felt that people, the native-born, don't know because immigrants and refugees have kept it from them for a variety of reasons, shame, the sense of gratitude, all kinds of reasons. And what I wanted to do is kind of lay bare these experiences. For example, in the section on waiting, I wanted to talk about how one of the biggest hardships of being in a refugee camp, which isn't just about not having, all the things that you need. It's the agony of waiting. So there was a refugee who told me, detention and camp are worse than jail or a prison, because in prison you count your days down, and in camp you count your days up. Yes, exactly. So this is just because this is something that most people in these populations have not experienced. I wanted to crack it open for them. So the book was titled Ungrateful Refugee because that was one example of things I wanted to, shed light on. But there was so much else. And also there was this kind of notion that each of these moments in the refugee life, these kind of 5 stages, have a beautiful parallel in the lives of people who've never been displaced. And I think that parallel is how we can understand them, which brings me to your question. Yes. How do we do better? And the way we do better is to recognize these parallels and try to find our way, to curiosity, to care, to all that stuff via these experiences that we ourselves have lived. So, for example, waiting. Even though most of us have not been in a refugee camp, we have all been made to wait. And we've been all made to wait by someone much more powerful. And we know how frustrating that is. And I think once you kind of understand that helps you, project empathy and care. One of the things that happened early in the pandemic is that a lot of people who had never really thought about refugees before emailed me and started being like, so is this what it feels like to wait for asylum? Because we're sitting here in our homes just waiting to be let out. And I said, yes, absolutely. Now you understand something of the immigrant experience. And I think you should use that. And most of them did, exactly like your group. So I think that the way to that is just to try to find this connection between your own lived experience and those of the displaced, and stop putting them in this giant category and just enter that relationship with curiosity and understanding that this is temporary. This isn't a refugee. This is a teacher or a doctor or a child or whatever who is having a refugee moment, who is having their 2 years of changing from an Iranian to an Iranian-American or, whatever. And that time, you're just raw. You're skinless. What you need is care while you rebuild that skin, and I think that's the key. And some of the best people in native-born populations that I've met, the most wonderful people have an instinctive understanding of that. And I had so many of those people, for example, in my church in Oklahoma, who kind of just guided us through to that moment, because they understood that it was temporary and that we were going to need a lot of care for like 2-3 years.
So it's recognizing that people need help. It's also being curious about them and where they come from and what their experiences are.
I think that curiosity is sometimes strangely missing. Sometimes it comes a little bit later, but it has to be individual curiosity, not just curiosity about, like, say, your story. How did you get here? What happened? What was the trauma? But more about the way we would, if I see one of you and I start talking to you, I would immediately be curious about your interests and what you're studying and what you're good at and all of that stuff. I mean, that stuff is just individual. And I think it's our instinct to go for that stuff, and we should.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's good. One of the things that this made me do was to go back and think about some research that I had done, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, which was about immigrant incorporation, not refugees necessarily, but how, and I looked at a number of different cities, including Syracuse, kind of mid-sized cities, and tried to measure in some ways how these folks became part of the community. In particular, I was talking about politics. So how many of them were registered to vote? How many of them voted? Were there people running for office? Did they hold? I mean,
were they involved?
What?
Were they? Did you find that they were involved?
The cities were different from each other, and they had different sorts of refugees. There were some that were in the west or southwest that had primarily Latin Americans. Here in Syracuse, we've had a long history of of immigrants of various sorts and refugees, and so there's much more diverse. And Syracuse actually did very well in terms of the level of voter registration among immigrants certain recency was very high. And we do have one person in particular I can think of that a lot of you probably know, Chal Majak, who is a Sudanese lost boy who is now a member of the Syracuse City Council, Common Council. And, he talks very positively about. And I think I would say that Syracuse is a refugee-friendly, wants to think of itself certainly as a refugee-friendly city, and has done certain things that I think, speak to that. Yeah. So I don't know where I was going from that. Just
I think you're right, because there's a big university here, and it's a coastal. I mean, so I think America is just such a vast place, and we are. I feel like most of our most friendliest cities tend to be kind of at the two edges. I don't know. I don't want to generalize again, but I feel like it just varies across the country. You can't really. My experience,
but it might give people who cared about it some notion of what they can do to get people involved and reach out to people, because they all have everybody has something to give and something to contribute. And I feel about Syracuse that the community in general has been has helped to make immigrants and refugees feel like part of the community. I mean, I think the phrase "new Americans," which is commonly used here, is good.
That is good, yeah. Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah. So I want to go on to your more general subject here, which is in the Who Can Be Believed book, at least.
Who Gets Believed.
Who Gets Believed. Which is about storytelling, essentially, and whose stories are believed, whose stories are dismissed, and so forth, which is really just really interesting, I think. And talk about that a little bit. It's complex, I think. Yeah. But you're talking about not only refugees who have to legally need to tell their stories and are not always believed. Yeah. And this seems to be just a well, I'll get back to that. And you also talk about your stint at Harvard Business School and working for McKinsey as a consultant, and learning how to tell stories in that context to be believed and, hired or invested with or whatever that your goal was be. Talk a little bit about how important storytelling is, and how in various situations you don't need to necessarily tell the truth, but you need to tell a convincing story.
Well, let me start by saying that this book came out of sort of the third section of the Ungrateful Refugee. So in the Ungrateful Refugee, as I was saying, there were all these phases of the refugee experience, and the third one was storytelling for asylum and whether or not you'll be believed. Again, another thing that we've all done, and so we can relate to. But when I was researching that section, there were I suddenly kept finding myself being pulled outside of the world of asylum to other vulnerable people. I kept thinking about trying to get the right kind of pain medication if you're a person of color. I kept thinking about, the wrongfully convicted. I have a very good friend who was a lawyer at the Innocence Project, and she was already telling me some stories about the wrongfully convicted, and I wanted to ask her more. But then I came across this one story that I couldn't include in the Ungrateful Refugee because it was yet unfinished. And it was a case in the UK of a man called KV. He's called KV in all of the court papers. That's an alias. The story was so astonishing that one, I couldn't fit it into the Ungrateful Refugee, and two, it was yet to go to the Supreme Court. And it went to the Supreme Court, I believe, in 2019. And then I fully finished researching it, and so I kind of made it the backbone of this book, Who Gets Believed. But I'll just tell you a little bit about this story because it'll blow your mind. So KV was a guy, he was a jeweler. He was the son of a jeweler, and he lived in Sri Lanka. And in 2011, he was on suspicion of helping the Tamil Tigers. The Sri Lankan government threw him in detention and tortured him heavily. Now, at that time, the Sri Lankan government was known to be torturing people in detention all in the same way, which was with hot soldering irons to the back and the backs of the arms. And this was well documented by humanitarian organizations and, all the country papers that the Home Office in the UK uses and all of the other immigration offices around the world use. So, Sri Lanka was doing this. There was a lot of, many refugees were pouring out of Sri Lanka and going to these other countries, all bearing the same scars on their backs. And they all looked similar, and they came in with similar stories. And of course, as you can imagine, if you're going from, en route from one country to another, how many Sri Lankan to English translators do you think are working this route? So a lot of the same translators with the same words, etc. They all had the same medications because, again, how many doctors, So what happened is with so many people coming through with the same story, I suppose, and this is where I have to guess what happened, but the asylum officers were desensitized, and suddenly they thought to themselves, someone somewhere along the line said, what if this is all made up? What if they did it to themselves in order to get asylum? So then they created this nifty little acronym called SIBP, self-infliction by proxy. Okay. And the by proxy part will really get you. Okay. Because they said, well, you can't reach your own back with a hot soldering iron. So maybe they got a doctor to put them under anesthesia and put these scars on their back so they could get UK asylum. Now, forget about the fact that what doctor is going to do this and to also defy every kind of Hippocratic oath and medical oath and whatever it is that they've taken to do this for the $0 that they could be given by this poor person trying to escape. It makes no sense. Also, all of the psychologists, were saying, of course, nobody would do this to themselves. This is unheard of. Nobody's ever been heard of to do this. And yet, the Home Office started rejecting people for this reason, and KV was one of those people who was rejected. he couldn't believe it. He was absolutely astonished. His case went to a tribunal and then an upper court. And both of those courts said, we're going to stick with the Home Office's assessment of this, which was dangerous because it meant they could keep using that assessment, right? And it took the Supreme Court in 2019 to say, wait a minute, there's some massive problems here. What you've done is that you've created this category to which you attach no burden of proof. Okay. And you're using it to up the burden of proof on every other possibility to the point of beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a criminal burden of proof, not an asylum burden of proof, right? Let's keep that in mind. For asylum, you don't need beyond a reasonable doubt. That's for criminal convictions, right? So you're upping the you're upping the burden of proof on every other bucket. And if your story doesn't meet these burden of proof for those buckets, you just sweep them right into this other bucket with zero burden of proof. It's like saying, well, I'm going to say that since you can't prove definitively these things, that aliens landed, and so we'll just go ahead and assume that that's the default option. You can't do that. That makes no sense. So the Supreme Court said you can't do that. KV won his case, which really only meant having to go back and be reassessed by the Home Office. But I guess I got to be the first person in the media that he really sat down with his lawyer and spoke to at length. And because I don't write about, I'm not a journalist and I'm not, an academic. I don't write things from, a macro point of view. I'm interested in people and their relationships, their scars, the look on their face, the experiences they're having. So that was such a valuable kind of hour and a half for me, just sitting there and talking to him, seeing his astonishment, his disbelief. It really truly was like he thought he was in a Kafka novel. And funny enough, his name was K, which is, Kafka. That they had assigned him the name K, and we're calling him K in all of the, I think, of course, they did that. They must have done that on purpose, right? I wish I could go to the judges and be like, at what point did you decide on K for this guy?
Yeah.
Anyway. So, that story, I was obsessed with that story. And so I had to include it. And then around the same time, I started talking to my friend at the Innocence Project who said, well, you want to know what passes for justice in this country? And she gave me some other cases of people that she could give me the cases for because they had just been released. After 30 years, wrongfully convicted and in prison.
And this was the British system.
America.
American.
Okay. Yeah. The
because
Innocence...
both of them are, you.
The people in the book?
Yeah.
Yeah. So exactly. The Innocence Project stories that I have are American. I mean, This was, she worked in Maryland in the Baltimore kind of offices. And I guess now she's gone somewhere in the Midwest. But yes, this was American justice system.
Yeah. But I guess the magnitude of people's unwillingness to believe these stories, or it's not always unwillingness to believe the story. It's just kind of they haven't quite told the story the best way.
Oh, right. Yes, you asked about that.
And I mean, I'd like to hear more about this, but ultimately, what can be done about it? I mean, it seemed to me that you were saying that both the British and the American asylum programs, how they're processed and how the decisions are made about who is going to get asylum, are just broken.
Oh yeah.
They're just not. And your accounts of how people are trained and how people, as you say in this story, come up with these crazy possibilities that knock down the stories of the people who are trying to get asylum, is just nuts, and they're kind of set up to fail.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that's a great unanswerable question. And what I find as a writer is when you have a situation in which the most important question is unanswerable, you don't write papers about it, you just go and write a play. Because really that's the only place where unanswerable questions are acceptable. But I think what tends to happen is when people go in search of the answers, in search of the truth, often they have their own version of truth in their mind. The Innocence Project lawyers told me, what ends up happening is that there's an initial hypothesis by the investigators. They think this is the truth. I've found it. And then they go looking for evidence to support that hypothesis, and they ignore every other kind of evidence. Or people are incentivized in a bad way. For example, asylum offices around Europe and America, this is what you're getting.
Yeah.
They are incentivized to reject. I talked anonymously with a Home Office presenting officer, a HOPO, as they call them, in the UK, which basically the asylum office's lawyers, you know. And I said, well, how do you see your job? What is your job? And by the way, this was a really friendly one, a woman of color. I thought, you know, I was very curious about her experience in the asylum office. And I said, what was your job as you understood it? And what I expected for her to say is, you know, to uphold my humanitarian duty as agreed to by the Refugee Convention of 1950 or whatever. And that's kind of the sort of answer I thought she would say. She said, to catch inconsistencies so I can reject. So I can, and I said, what? And she said, my job is to find inconsistencies. And I said, do you hear what you're saying? And she's like, yeah. And then she was silent. I mean, that was her job. The incentives across the board were like that. I talked to someone who was in the cafeteria for the Dutch, asylum offices in, what's the name of that little town? You read the book more recently than I wrote it. There's a small town. There's a small town in near, I guess, Amsterdam, where the asylum offices are. But anyway, so this guy going into the cafeteria said, you know, you would overhear people saying, "Oh yeah, you know, I couldn't find anything on this guy. I mean, he was a real and true activist, you know, back in whatever country. But finally, I found it." Look, wait, you just said real and true activist, you know? So anyway, but that's, if you're incentivized on something, if someone tells you that you will do a good job if you meet X criteria, then you work toward that criteria. That's what human nature is, you know? And as far as storytelling and the wrong kinds of stories go, aside from the things we understand about ourselves, like our incentives, there's all of this just world of bias about what we think is a credible person, a credible story, and it comes from our own, you know, storytelling origins. You know, what kind of stories were we told as children? And that is entirely cultural. So one example that I use is I was talking to an asylum lawyer in the Netherlands, and I said, you know, well, I understand your job is to help craft these stories. What is the most difficult part of your job? And he said, do you know what the most difficult is? And I said, what? And he's like, he looks me right in the eye and he's like, the Iranians. And I'm like, what? And he says, well, you know, because the Iranians, you tell them to, you know, tell me your story about how you escaped the country and why. And they don't start at the beginning of their troubles with the government. And they don't start at the beginning, like, of their life. They start at the beginning of the universe. And so I thought, oh, well, you know what? I know why that is. I know exactly why that is. And he said, why? And I said, because in Iran, every single story, not just in childhood, your entire life, starts with the beginning of the universe rhyme. Okay. And so as a result of that, which I can still do, by the way, so it starts with the beginning of the universe rhyme. And I think that the impact that has had on Iranian storytelling is to make you think about your life as a speck in the universe and to give perspective and humility, you know, and there's a sense that you're being almost immodest if you just jump into your problems. It's cultural, it's storytelling culture. But imagine if someone is just escaping from Iran and they're, you know, a person from a rural place, a village, and they're like a grandmother and they've never been to the West and never watched American movies, anything of the sort. They get into that asylum office and they start telling that story, you know, zooming out as they're taught to do. Well, they're going to look like a liar to a Dutch person. And that is a pretty persistent problem across, you know, asylum storytelling across the world, because people, you know, receive stories according to their own biases, their culture, their education, who they empathize with.
Well, I guess I would ask then, are there people in these countries, in the Netherlands, in Britain, here, who know what you're saying? That it's not good to have your goal be rejections.
Yes.
And we are not understanding the stories that people are telling very well. How are there any movements to change the process? And if so,
what are they? Absolutely. So first of all, there's a lot of, charities and nonprofits and
Right.
people whose job it is, or whose
Well, thank
mission.
God for them,
Exactly.
obviously. And
Exactly. and they do a lot of work toward this. One of the ones that I found in the UK that are doing incredible work, they're called Freedom from Torture.
Right.
And their organization is meant to help torture survivors. And the kinds of things they do is incredible. First of all, they have storytelling classes to help torture survivors really process what happened to them. But they also have doctors and lawyers and others who, kind of work on all of these things like pamphlets, etc., about how torture survivors process that. I talked to a doctor at Freedom from Torture, the head of doctors there, and she was telling me about how trauma memories are stored. And she said that what happens when you're undergoing a great trauma is that, there's the part of the brain that stores contextual information, and that part almost shuts down. You are not taking in the context. You don't remember things like how many hours passed, a day of the week, how long you walked right after you were freed in your bare feet. But the part of the brain that stores sensory information, that goes into hyperdrive. So you really remember, the red of the blood, the smell of the whatever, the white car over there. So what happens is when these people get into the asylum office and they start telling their story, the asylum officer's like, wait, how can you remember there were 3 white vans over there and not remember that it was a Tuesday? How could it be that you walked, from here to here, which is 20 miles, and you're telling me you walked for about 30 minutes? Okay? So they sound like liars. They're not lying. That's how the brain stores that information. And Freedom from Torture is working really hard to get into the Home Office and try to give them that education. And there are even asylum officers who are receptive to this. For example, the former Hopo who talked to me. I mean, she knew I was writing a book about this and for what reason. She did it anonymously, but she was honest and she said to me, the reason, what I thought I could do there is change the place from within. No, I couldn't change the incentive system, but I could be the advocate a couple of times for that person whose culture I know. And I could try to change the culture a little bit, because part of that hostile environment comes from people who've worked there for 30 years and are gone. They're desensitized. They shouldn't be doing that job anymore. And I can bring in kind of a fresh energy. She told me this wonderful story about a time when a young woman, I think, was almost sent away because nobody believed that she had carried on this kind of incredible love of her life romance with 2 meetings in cars, I'd never really seen the guy again. And in the middle of this interrogation, she, as the lawyer for the asylum office, for the Home Office, stepped forth and said, no, I have to tell you that in this culture, this is absolutely normal. So I'm not going to, poke holes in that part of the story anymore. And I think that was really powerful. It's a small thing to do. But she was changing things from within, I think.
So if you could work to change, it sounds mildly encouraging.
Yeah,
what's happening in Britain. The United States, maybe not. I mean,
there are kind people everywhere.
There are kind people everywhere. But if you could come up with some changes in the practices or different rules or different incentives for our folks who, and you have lots of accounts of people in America dismissing, the refugees' stories and just kind of, they're tired of hearing it, whatever. Yeah. And so what would you do? I mean, what could be done?
Okay. So keep in mind, what I'm going to say is, forgetting the practicalities. And this is short and medium term. And I do understand, the practical world in which we live. I will steer clear of my ultimate ideal if I were like queen of the world, in which I would not have borders and border policies. But forget my idealism. I'll put that in a novel. Yeah. But for the current systems that we have, what I would change is, first of all, I would train people who are the gatekeepers in cultural storytelling. I would change their I would change their incentive systems so that they are trained and incentivized to uphold, our humanitarian duties and to find people to save. I would kind of give them much better country reports to show them what's going on in every place. One of the biggest things I would do is I would change the rules that keep people from being able to work while they're waiting for their papers. Because one of the things that really happens that is heartbreaking is that people come with all of these skills, and all of this fire, especially children. They're like, they were the best in their school, or they were a happy kid who liked to play sports. And then they spend 2 or 3 years waiting in a camp, stagnating, and they come out the other side different people. So I would have, kind of speed up the process for asylums. I would have schools in the camps. I would allow people to work while they wait. Here is a chance for them to pay some taxes, while they're waiting to get their asylum.
Right.
Why wouldn't we let them do this? And often they take the jobs nobody else wants. Do you know in the UK, you can have your asylum rejected even if you're found to volunteer while you wait, because that's working. It's just working for zero money, So there's all these absurd...
What's the logic of that?
It's no logic. The logic is just dumbness. But anyway, but there's all kinds of rules that restrict people, and they basically just kind of douse their fire. And then we complain because then 10 years down the road, they've got trauma and they've got and they're not useful enough, or they haven't done well enough when, their first few years, they could have been thriving. Let's see what else. Oh, yes. One of the things that asylum lawyers told me that across the board, they said is the biggest problems that we have is that one lawyer told me, do you know what the biggest indicator of whether or not you'll be granted asylum is? And that is if you have representation before you talk to anyone from the any asylum officer or any border guard or anything like that. Because lawyers understand the definition of refugee, and they'll keep you from saying too much, because it's possible that you come in, a border guard gets you, they ask you questions, and you just say everything. You say the whole truth, and life is messy and complicated. So maybe you did escape because of your religious beliefs, but you also had some money trouble. You say both those things, and they will immediately put you in the money trouble category, and say you're an economic migrant. They won't be like, well, maybe it will. They won't give you the benefit of the doubt. So if you have a lawyer at the beginning, they will help you say the right thing, even though it is the truth, but it is only the part of the truth that is relevant here. And also, some things are really counterintuitive. So, for example, there was this guy, fascinating story, a guy that I met who was an asylum lawyer and a top prize-winning one in the UK. And only 12 years before he won one of the big prizes for being an asylum lawyer, he was in the back of a truck crossing over into the UK from France, and he had come from Iran, and he was a refugee and all that. But the difference between him and a lot of others is that already he read lots of books. He was very educated. He knew how to research. So he came in, and when it was time for his asylum interview, he confessed to things. Like, for example, here's all the things I did to piss off the government. Here are the shady characters with whom I was in cahoots that again pissed off the government. Here's the bribe money that I took. And he understood that those things didn't make him look bad. They made him look in danger, right? And so, like, you need a lawyer to really hear your entire story to help craft that. And so I think one of the changes I would make is to give everyone a shot to have representation before they speak to someone. Once you say something, by the way, your story cements, you can never take it back. One of the most heartbreaking examples in Europe anyway is when people come in, they come in because they're from a country where they persecute, the queer community, like Iran, for example, where you could be hanged for being gay. So, but at the same time, they've been raised in this homophobic culture. So they escape the country because they're gay and in danger. They arrive to this new country in Europe, and suddenly they're like, you know what? I think I'm just going to say I'm a Christian, and they don't realize you're not credible as a Christian. Like, you don't know all the stuff you need to know. You're credible as gay. Like, just be that, please. But they don't. So they give that first answer thinking they can write it out. Then for a couple of years, maybe they have all these wonderful charities and organizations help them. They give them confidence. They give them a feeling of safety and security. And they're able to come out and say their truth. It's too late. Like, why'd you lie about being a Christian? They say that, and this is another thing, by the way, that charities are trying to train asylum offices on. Yeah. Sorry, I rattled.
No,
That's
those are good stories.
I think it's a good segue into the Q&A part too.
Okay.
So, just Dina, listening to you talk about the importance of representation in that process, it just was impossible not to think about the comparisons to the criminal justice system,
Yes.
and then to think, okay, well, then is the starting
Which
point.
she talks about too. We haven't gotten to that.
Is to think of these folks as the accused.
Yes.
And so, that's powerful. Okay, so we've got a good chunk of time for some questions. I see a hand up right there. And Jackie, want to get the microphone and we'll get started. Great. And thanks to the two of you for a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for reading both books in such a short time. You must be sick of me.
Good evening, everyone. Dina and Christy, thank you very much for this lovely conversation. My name is Fethi. I teach part-time in the anthropology department. I spent the last 20 years reading about, refugee stories and narratives in the U.S. Spent a little over a year trying to understand Bosnian refugee experiences in the central New York region. I had a quick question about a sort of niche topic of sorts that I believe is not getting the attention that it deserves. When responding to Christy's question about, what would you do, what would you change, and so on and so forth, you gave us some, wonderful suggestions as to, how some outcomes could be changed for the better. But what about the availability of highly qualified language professionals?
Oh, yes, of course.
So, whether you're talking about, asylum claims or, refugee claims and other types of immigration processing issues and stuff like that, so much hangs in the balance. If you do not have access to a highly qualified language professional who would facilitate, the conversation between the asylum claimant and the asylum officer, a lot of things could go, north, south, whatever. So
you're absolutely right. I talk about this a little bit in the book, but I guess I would answer that by telling you a story about when I was in London and I was accompanying a recent arrival, a family who were refugees, Iranians who had come to London, and they were applying for social housing. And so I went with them to the social housing office with the wife specifically because the husband was sick. And so at first they didn't want to let me in because they Googled me, and then I kind of threatened to bring a lawyer and said I'm coming with her, and I did. So I went with her, and they said, okay, but you cannot be the translator. We are going to have to use our own Iranian translator. So they brought in this woman who was shaking. And they started the conversation, and I sat silently while she mistranslated literally everything. She knew hardly any Farsi words, and everything that my friend said, she mistranslated. I had to jump in and be like, I'm sorry. And then I was talking with her in Farsi at length, and finally she said, the guy was being so robotic, so wooden, and finally she stepped in and she's like, listen, she speaks Farsi better than me. I'm going to excuse myself. And she left. Afterwards, we actually kind of texted. It was nice. But she couldn't speak Farsi. She was a lovely human being. This happens all the time. I had a lawyer in the U.S. tell me about a time when a translator didn't translate the word Daesh said, why are you never mentioning ISIS? And she's like, what? ISIS is an English acronym. We don't call them ISIS. I've said about Daesh a bunch of times. Anyway, so just the translation is, there's no checks on it. People come in, they put something on their resume, they do it badly, and that often they doom people. Organizations like Freedom from Torture and others like it in the UK and the US are often fighting appeal cases and helping people appeal in cases where the translation has been so bad that a story that is absolutely wrong has been cemented, into a person's documents and now has to be traced back to the bad translation and kind of removed and fixed. And of course, they'll never admit that it's because of the bad translation that this happened. So I wonder what will happen now with AI, if they're going to start using it to translate. Yeah. I read a scary article a couple of years ago. I wonder if you read this too, about when about how they weren't just using AI to translate, but there was some kind of incubator sort of program about using AI to detect accents, whether or not they were definitely from that region. I mean, that is fraught because, I mean, in this world that is so very mobile, I mean, how do you know if this person who says that they're from Isfahan didn't spend like 6 months in their teenage years over here in Ardabil or whatever and got the Ardabil accent? I mean, it's just really, it's frightening.
Let this person up here and we'll come down.
Hi.
Hi.
I just had a question. You mentioned the Freedom of Torture, the
From-
organization. Freedom from Torture, sorry. And I was just wondering if there were any other organizations that played a role in your research when you were researching for both your books.
Yeah. I had a couple of charities in the UK that I worked with. So one of them was Refugee Support. I love Refugee Support. I'm now a trustee. Their whole mission is aid with dignity. I have never seen an organization like this. So it started because these two men were volunteering in Calais, and they were both businessmen. And they'd kind of become a little bit, I guess, you know, they were at a crossroads in their business lives and wanted to help the world. And so they went to Calais to volunteer. And they met each other. And one of the first things they were asked to do is to give out donated clothing. But the volunteers were standing on the back of the truck and throwing the clothing at the refugees, you know. And people were having to trade them. If they said, hey, my mother is sick in bed, she can't come here, but can I get a jacket for her? They were like, no, you can't get 2 jackets. And she's like, but my mother, I have her card right here. No, can't get 2 jackets. Then people were having to do this undignified thing of trading with each other or like begging, and it was awful. And they said, what can we do to give people the aid that's allocated for them without just absolutely rubbing their face in the dirt, you know? So they got together, and the first project that they did was that they started, they would gather all of the donated stuff at refugee camps in a warehouse, and then they would set up storefronts, like stores in the camp. And everybody who came in, they would give them a certain number of points. So the point system was like, if you're an adult, you get 100 points. If you're a pregnant woman, you get 150. If you're a teenager, you get 75. Although I think the teenagers should probably get like 125. If you're a kid, you get 50. And then you can add up your family's points and you can shop, you know, and there's not these baskets of food where they've decided what you'll have. You can decide if you'll have tea or coffee. If you want to like blow all of your points on chocolate spread, you're an adult. You get to do that, you know, and people loved it, and people were wonderfully behaved. You know, nothing happened that they thought would happen. They came in and they shopped because everyone knows what it is to go to the corner store and shop. And he said that the most gratifying moment for him was when people would start to like complain. It'd be like, this is the wrong kind of yogurt, because it means they've forgotten they were a refugee. It means that they thought they were in their corner store. That was a sign of success. And of course, nobody complained rudely, but they would come in and say, you know, I think you got the low-fat yogurt this time. And he loved it. And so that was an organization. They took me kind of under the guise of a volunteer to a bunch of camps, and it was wonderful to go. There was Host Nation that that made friendships based on people's interests between a native-born person and a refugee of about the same age, not based on like, do you want to give charity, based on, do you both enjoy football, you know, and you live in the same neighborhood, or do you both want to read French literature together? A lot of great friendships formed there. What else? There was another one. Oh, the Helen Bamber Foundation here in the U.S. There was mostly the Innocence Project and the ACLU, a couple of others. It's all in the book somewhere. I feel like there was a long time where I was just like elbow deep in like documents, court cases, and just stuff like that. I hope that answers your question.
Well, shortly after family separation was going on here, I went to speak with our congressman, who was a Republican who had opposed that. And I was talking to him about asylum. He told me, well, all those claims are bogus. And I said, all? And he said, 90%. Now, we have a project here, a track project, that has statistics on these things.
Yeah.
And it turns out that I think the number, I may be remembering wrong, of people who pass the credible fear interview, which is the first step and is the asylum officer step, is something like 90%. But actually, the majority of people do lose their cases, but it's a small majority and is wildly variable by region.
Yeah.
And
they lose their cases because they don't talk to representation before they have that interview.
Right,
you know?
right. But,
so they say one extra thing.
And it's supposed to be not a strict test. It's just a screening step. But my question is to kind of relate. So you have these stories and the cultural thing, and I'm wondering how much that culture is a product of the current politics, where there's been intense concern about refugees have been demonized in this country, and a big cause of concern since the Syrian crisis in Europe, or whether it's a permanent state of affairs that the sort of cultural problems that you're seeing.
I don't think there is actually a cultural barrier. I do think it's a product of, current politics and the stoking of natural human fears. It was different 30 years ago when I was a kid and I got, asylum. My family came. I mean, there was a feeling in the air that, as America had a duty to the rest of the world. America is this incredible, lucky country, this country that is, has so much and so much power and money and influence and they can help. And that was the idea that most people around me seem to believe, Now, I just have a hard time believing that it's the culture that makes it so different now, so much as the stoking of fear, especially because when I talk to individual people, I see so many similarities. I mean, for one thing I notice is that even in little hostile communities and stuff, every time you bring a refugee family, people slowly start to change their mind. They start to say things at first like, well, refugees are still bad, but he's good. He's okay. Or this family's okay. And then 2 or 3 come in and then maybe they start to change their mind and not admit it. But one thing I've noticed is there is so much more in common culturally between, say, a surgeon in Isfahan and a surgeon in, say, Syracuse than there is between those 2 surgeons and their own teenage daughter, It's true, because the fact is, we are all human. We kind of live through generational cultural stuff and we go through particular kind of universal life moments. And so I completely reject the notion that culture keeps us apart. In fact, often that's the stuff that brings us together. I mean, people accept, refugees from the Middle East, usually starting with their food, People start to connect with each other's stories. Do you know some of the most beloved things out of Iran is the music, the movies, the literature, and the food, right? That's the culture. It's not, and American culture is not being afraid of refugees. American culture is like Thanksgiving, and Iranians love that. So yeah, I don't think it's such a divide as you think.
Hi. So you kind of talked about the importance of representation, especially with asylum interviews, and you also mentioned how when interviewing a woman of color who worked in one of these organizations was also my job is to find inconsistencies. Yeah. So while representation is obviously very important, how do you counteract those issues in the system of how it's supposed to operate when even when there is representation, it might not be helpful or supportive just because that's kind of their job is to find inconsistencies.
Okay, so just to clarify, so the person I interviewed whose job it is to catch inconsistencies was the government's lawyer. So they were on the other side of the case. They were on the side of the case where they wanted to reject these cases. They were from the Home Office. But the representation I mean is the people who are the lawyer for the asylum seekers. So that's what levels the playing field. You have this formidable young lawyer on the side of the government looking for inconsistencies. What you want is a formidable young lawyer on the side of the asylum seeker, just checking that story and making sure that the right things are put on the record. Then it's kind of a level playing field. But if the asylum seeker doesn't have, let's say, this background or knowledge or education, and they kind of go in and they look at, say, this woman of color who's from their own background, and they spill, then it's over, right? Because the other side has everything they need.
Yeah.
I want to work our way over to this side of the room, but we'll get this person, and then the microphone will go over there. Okay.
So I just want to, I guess, link to this last point that you made, because I'm curious to what extent you've noticed differences, or whether you notice differences in the experiences of refugees and immigrants based on like the, racial differences they have. Because I happen to be a Bosnian refugee to the United States, and I also worked with a lot of refugees, and I do feel like, I can relate somewhat to this ungrateful refugee profile, but I feel like for me and my family, a lot of times we got it easy because, we're white and we fit in very easily. And I didn't get the sense in general, and also in working with a lot of Bosnian refugees, I didn't get the sense that there was this attitude of like, you should be grateful. And there was definitely also like, oh, you Bosnian refugees, they do amazing things, and they, develop, and like, look at how you're advancing our society and all this kind of stuff. And I have a feeling like that's not the experience of all refugees and immigrants in the United States.
Yeah. I do think it's very, very racial. Like when I was a young girl, we arrived, we were very clearly from Iran. My family, I'm the lightest of my family, so I actually had it okay once I started dyeing my hair. But anyway, but it was very much like, sand, N-word, and terrorists, and all this stuff that they called us. And it was all based on the fact that we were from the Middle East. In Europe, the treatment of Syrian refugees from Ukrainian refugees is just night and day. The level of empathy, the kind of media that they get, just how quickly they integrate into society, all of that stuff is it's racism is alive and well. I think my experience, which again is completely anecdotal, is that maybe sometimes it feels a little bit worse in Europe, because in America, you guys have, here you've been reckoning with, kind of the experience of Black Americans, and they have voices, and, it's harder to just be openly racist the way you can over in Europe, but, there's more empathy among the British people for the Ukrainians.
Sure.
And the worst off, as far as I've seen in terms of acceptance, are refugees from Africa.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much for interesting talk. My question is about the assimilation of refugees.
Yes.
So I don't know if you noticed that thing during your research. There are some cases I've seen, the refugees who came from certain countries, and they are trying to reconnect the people who are already settled because they share common country, origin, or culture, or religion, language.
Yeah.
But they're not really welcome because they are in the status of refugee. But the ones who are already like assimilated are feeling like a burden because there's some certain expectations. Sometimes, refugees, some of them expect certain treatments by their, let's say, former country fellows to bypass some restrictions. For example, creating for them or finding for them extra job opportunities, income generation. So, did you touch on those kind of things? Because this is a kind of this is from recent refugee examples I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, like rejection and racism within particular communities, it's absolutely there, pervasive. I didn't cover it in my books, but I've seen it in my research, and I think I was talking to this Iranian researcher who was saying, gosh, it's so very hard to unpack all this, because there's like minorities within minorities and different layers of like social strata that come from home and also here. But it is very much human instinct to kind of roll up the ladder behind you. And also, once you're there, to tell yourself that you are exceptional. And I think other people coming in, doing, as well as you, needing your help, needing you to give what you're given, it's hard, especially after you've just been through a bunch of stuff yourself, and now here you are. One of the things that was most shocking to me was my own mother, who is such a kind, person, and she was a persecuted Christian in Iran. And one day, this family, I said before, I went to the housing office with them. I invited them over to lunch. My mom was there, and she just sat there looking suspicious. And then she started asking questions. So what was your church in Iran? Did you go to the underground church? And also, was it at this address? And I'm like, Mom, like I had to like pull her in the other room and be like, you need to like cool it, man. But she was naturally suspicious, and it happens. And I don't think there's anything more to say about that other than the fact that we're all human, and we think of ourselves as exceptional. And I think we just need to examine all those biases. It's not exclusive to the native born.
Go right there. Wait, right here?
Okay, go ahead wherever you were going to go. I think this gentleman here. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I should say, given that you asked something that is another one of life's unanswerable questions, I am actually writing a play about this. Yes. Me and a friend of mine who's a Korean writer, a Korean-American writer, we are writing a play with a Korean-American and an Iranian-American and all their terrible instincts towards, full Koreans and full Iranians. It's going to be good.
Well, we will put you in touch with a couple of the folks here from Syracuse Stage before you go.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Hi. So before I start going, I have trouble kind of articulating myself, but I think when I start kind of going into the topic I want to discuss, you'll kind of pick up what I'm saying. This gentleman down there, he kind of brought up the topic of culture, and you kind of your answer to that. I kind of wanted you to readdress your answer to that and see if you double down, because when that individual brought up race, you were kind of talking about racism and that aspect. To me, the two kind of coincide, because a culture from maybe say an African culture, because my family, I'm first generation, so all my family is immigrants, and they're African, that makes them black, and their culture is affected. So how can you say culture doesn't really, how can you say culture is a non-factor, but race is a factor, considering different races provide different culture, if you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I think it's kind of all about the semantics of these words. What do they mean? To me, I guess what I was trying to say is, yes, racism is a huge part of our lives and our societies, but I don't want to say that they're part of the culture, because for me, a culture is something that's kind of, inherent to the experience of being from that place. And it's something that I guess I put a positive value to as something that is, but you're right that there's racist aspects to cultures. For example, in the Netherlands, they have this practice called the Black Peets, where they put people in blackface at Christmas time to play Santa's helpers. And that is cultural and it's racist, But I guess what I was trying to say isn't that this doesn't exist or to kind of draw a line, but to simply say that I think most of the fear does come from political sources and history, much more than the culture that we love. It's not that, say, Iranians or Sri Lankans or, Syrians or any of these people culturally clash. I actually think those cultures, when they're different, kind of can meld into each other and make each other better. It's that they clash in their histories and politics and maybe motivations and all kinds of things like that. But I agree with you that these definitions are all very blurry. I make up my own definition of culture, as does, anyone else. So
maybe one more question. We'll get right down here in the front. Sorry, Jackie, I made you go the farthest distance I could have made you go.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here and discuss with us. And I was also curious because the refugee stuff right now is a highly political term right now, and a lot of politicians are trying to gain advantage from it. And what I wanted to say is, I view this as a immigration kind of problem, because people are not willing that I wanted to use Israel as an example. Like they wanted to keep their Jew as their main ethnic there. They wanted to a Jew country, so they didn't want to accept all the Palestinian in there.
Yeah.
I guess that's one of the biggest questions that why there's so much conflict there, because Israel because the only solution would be like there need to be a two nation there, and one should be the Israel nation and one should be the Palestinian nation, and then Israel would never take all the people in there as a counter citizenship. So there's a dilemma there, I guess. Like when we're talking about refugee question, people are often thinking like, whoa, they're coming and they're taking charge from us. Like they become citizens, they can vote, and they make us our voting like less important compared because the whole population is increased and our and our race group people had less votes compared to before. So that I know that's why like how people are not willing to like US will never get everyone is citizenship, like because there's a lot of people that don't agree with it, like this really say this they're still in our country, like the refugees. So how do you wielding this kind of kind of question there, and how would you trying to help and solve this question? Because I think that's what essential about it, because people are not saying like I don't like you, or I don't like your culture, or I don't like your race, I don't like you, you're lying, like you cannot remember all of your story. I think that's not what is essential. What is essential is they're here and they make my voting less important. They make me less voiceless. They make me
people say the other things because they're not willing to just say that out loud, that I am not willing to give up a certain level of comfort in order for someone to have their life, and that's really hard to admit. And so, I think they kind of go to the, to those other talking points, like, oh, they're lying, or they're just taking advantage or whatever. But I mean, as far as the practicalities go, unfortunately, I am not an expert in that. I do think, though, that we should close some of these holes in our systems that create incredible injustices, especially the injustices that are kind of class-based and race and culture-based. So, for example, the whole idea that, like, if you tell your story in an Iranian way or a Chinese way or a Korean way, that you're going to not be believed automatically. I mean, that's appalling to me, The idea that we could have certain kinds of education and we don't is appalling to me. Asylum lawyers said to me, the whole system is rigged to benefit the people who have the most education, the most money, and access to Western media, and also who are closer to Western, kind of education and background. That's a hole in the system that I think needs to be fixed. But otherwise, no, I mean, I don't have a perfect practical solution. I do understand, you're right, that a lot of the reason is because of limited resources and practicalities. I guess the question that we have to deal with as a society is what do we owe to the least of our citizens versus someone that's not a citizen but who's way worse off? Like, how do we weigh that? How do we weigh, the good and the benefit to someone who is kind of over here, but one of us, versus someone who's maybe dying, but not one of us? And that's kind of a bigger philosophical question that we have to think of.
All right. Well, this has been very thought-provoking, obviously. And obviously what's come through is I think these two books are definitely something that we should look into. I want to remind you that they're out there at the reception. And what's also clear, I think, from Christy's conversation with you is that they're, in addition to being insightful and important, they're really interesting reads. So I want to thank the two of you for the conversation.
Thank
Dina,
you.
in particular, thank
you
for
so much.
coming out.
Thank you. Thanks.
So please come join us for the reception outside, and we can continue these conversations. So thank you.